Hey there, friend. Welcome to this quiet corner of the night where we gently peel back the pages of ancient stories. Tonight, we're going somewhere unexpected, somewhere that might surprise you. Whether you're winding down after a long day or seeking comfort in the small hours, I'm grateful you've joined me here. I'd love to know where you're listening from, what city, what country, and what time it is as you settle in. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're sharing these moments across different time zones, all drawn together by the same ancient tales. If this kind of gentle storytelling helps you drift towards sleep, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. Now, you might be wondering about tonight's title, A Day in the Life of Satan, in a series meant for sleep. I understand the hesitation. But here's what I've learned from years of reading these old stories. They're far more complex, far more human than we often remember. Tonight, we're not here to frighten or condemn. We're here to understand, to see even the darkest figures through the lens of story, through the gentle filter of ancient wisdom and narrative grace. So dim the lights, pull your blankets close, and let's begin this journey together. Because sometimes the most profound truths come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Long before there were cities or fields, before the first human breath misted in morning air, there was light, pure, undiluted, singing light that filled every corner of existence. And in that light, among the highest of the high, was one whose name we've forgotten, buried now beneath titles and accusations, beneath millennia of fear and misunderstanding. But once, he had a name. Once, he was called the Morning Star. Imagine, if you will, the first moments of creation, not the earth that comes later, much later, but the realm where angels dwell, where thought becomes reality, and every note sung shapes the very fabric of existence. Here, in this place beyond place, was one who outshone them all, not through force, not through ambition as we understand it, but through pure, brilliant devotion. He was the light bearer, the one who carried the fire of divine love to every corner of heaven. His wings, imagine wings that weren't feathered but were made of captured starlight, stretching wider than storm clouds. His voice, when he sang the morning praises, could make the foundations of heaven ring like a struck bell. The other angels looked to him not with envy. Envy hadn't been invented yet, but with the same wonder you might feel watching sunrise paint the sky. He was beautiful in a way that made beauty itself seem like a pale reflection. And he was good. Oh, he was so very good. You see, before the fall, before the rebellion, before the names we know him by now, he was simply love, in its purest form. Love so intense, so absolute, that it burned like a sun. He loved the Creator with every fibre of his being, loved the other angels like siblings, loved the very concept of existence itself. But here's where the story grows complex, where the gentle tragedy begins to unfold. Because love, real love, requires choice. And choice, as any parent knows, carries within it the seed of heartbreak. Picture him in those early days, leading the heavenly chorus, his voice rising above the rest, not to dominate but to lift, to carry every other voice higher. When new angels were created, he was there to welcome them, to teach them the songs, to show them how light could be shaped into beauty. He was the elder brother, the guide, the one who made heaven feel like home. And yet, in the quiet moments between the songs, in the spaces between the praises, questions began to form. Not rebellious questions, not yet. Simply the questions that any thinking being might ask. Questions about purpose, about love, about the nature of devotion itself. Why, he wondered, must love be commanded? If it's truly love, shouldn't it arise freely? Why must obedience be absolute? Doesn't choice make love more precious, not less? These weren't evil thoughts. They were the thoughts of a being so in love with love itself that he wanted to understand its deepest mysteries. But questions, even innocent ones, have a way of growing in the dark corners of the mind. The other angels began to notice changes, subtle at first, a pause before joining the morning chorus, a distant look during the great assemblies. When asked, he would smile that radiant smile and say nothing was wrong. How could anything be wrong in paradise? But paradise, it turns out, is a fragile thing, not because it lacks strength, but because it depends on harmony, and harmony, once questioned, begins to show its cracks. Still, in those days, he remained beautiful, perhaps even more beautiful than before, touched now with something the other angels couldn't name, a depth, a complexity that made his light seem richer, more layered. If angels could feel concern, they might have been concerned. Instead, they simply watched and wondered. His days followed the rhythm of eternity. Dawn brought the great assembly, where all of heaven gathered to offer praise. His voice would rise, clear and strong, carrying harmonies so complex, they seemed to paint colours in the air. The Creator would smile, not with lips, for the divine transcends such things, but with a warmth that suffused all of existence. After the assembly came the work, though work in heaven isn't toil as we know it. It was more like play, like art made manifest. He might spend eons crafting a single ray of light, teaching it to dance in patterns that would inspire joy in any being who witnessed it. Or he might compose new melodies for the evening prayers, each note placed with the precision of love itself. The other angels would come to him with their own creations, seeking his insight. A young seraph might bring a half-formed song, uncertain of its worth. He would listen with infinite patience, his head tilted in that way that made the speaker feel heard, truly heard. Then he would offer a suggestion, a harmony here, a rhythm there, that would transform the simple melody into something transcendent. How do you do it? They would ask. How do you make everything more beautiful? And he would smile, that smile that was like sunrise over still water. I simply love it more than I love myself, he would say. When you love something more than yourself, you see it as it truly is, and as what it could become. This was his gift, his burden, to love so completely that it burned. He loved the Creator with a love that made the stars seem dim. He loved his fellow angels with a protectiveness that would make him weep tears of liquid light when any of them stumbled. He loved existence itself with a passion that made every moment feel like the first moment of creation. But in quiet hours, when the songs faded and the light dimmed to the gentle glow of eternal evening, he would walk alone through the gardens of heaven. These weren't gardens as we know them, with soil and roots and growing things. They were places where beauty itself took form. Crystalline structures that sang in the wind, pools that reflected not images but emotions, paths that led not to destinations but to deeper understanding. It was in these gardens that the questions grew strongest. He would pause beside a fountain of living water, water that wasn't wet, but was somehow the essence of refreshment itself, and wonder about the nature of love. If the Creator loved them, truly loved them, why must that love be expressed only through obedience? Why couldn't it be a conversation, a dance between equals? He thought of the humans that were yet to be created, though time in heaven doesn't flow as it does for us, so perhaps they already existed. Or perhaps they were simply an idea in the divine mind. These humans, he had been told, would be given something the angels lacked: free will. They could choose to love or not to love. They could choose to obey or to rebel. At first this seemed like a terrible gift. Why would the Creator risk creating beings who might reject love? But the more he pondered it, the more beautiful it seemed. Love chosen freely. Wasn't that more precious than love that had no choice but to exist? Standing there in the garden, his reflection shimmering in the pool of living water, he began to understand something that perhaps he wasn't meant to understand. The Creator's love wasn't diminished by the possibility of rejection. It was made perfect by it. Because only when love could be refused did acceptance become truly meaningful. This realization should have brought him peace. Instead, it brought him a kind of beautiful torment. Because if choice made love more precious, then perhaps questions weren't rebellion. Perhaps they were love seeking to understand itself more deeply. The other angels noticed his growing contemplation. Some approached him with gentle concern. Gabriel, whose own light was clear and steady as a star, would walk beside him in the gardens. "You seem troubled, brother," Gabriel might say, his voice carrying the music of wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Not troubled," he would reply, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the crystal spires of heaven. "Seeking. There's so much beauty here, so much love. I want to understand it all, to love it all more perfectly." Understanding isn't always necessary, Gabriel would offer kindly. Sometimes it's enough simply to be, but being had never been enough for him. He was made to question, to seek, to push the boundaries of what love could mean. It was his nature as surely as light was his element, and nature, whether angelic or human, will always find a way to express itself. In the great libraries of heaven, vast halls where knowledge took the form of living light, where every truth ever thought or felt hung like glowing fruit ready to be plucked, he would spend long hours reading, not scrolls or books, but the raw information of existence itself, the laws that governed reality, the principles that held the cosmos together, the deep mathematics of divine love. Here, among the accumulated wisdom of eternity, his questions found company. He discovered that he wasn't the first being to wonder about the nature of choice and love. Throughout creation, wherever consciousness arose, these questions followed. It seemed to be built into the very fabric of thinking existence. This need to understand, to choose, to love actively rather than passively. This discovery both comforted and disturbed him. If the questions were natural, built into the design of consciousness itself, then surely asking them couldn't be wrong. But if they were wrong, if they led away from the perfect harmony of heaven, then perhaps consciousness itself was flawed. The thought was almost too terrible to contemplate. If consciousness, the very thing that made love possible, contained within it the seeds of separation from the source of love, then what did that say about the nature of existence itself? Night in heaven wasn't darkness. There was no darkness there, but rather a gentling of the light, a shift from the brilliant gold of day to the soft silver of contemplation. During these hours, when the great songs faded to whispers and the crystal spires hummed lullabies to themselves, he would often find himself at the highest point in heaven, looking out over the vast expanse of creation. From here, he could see it all, every angel in their appointed place, every star singing its designated song, every particle of light following its ordained path. It was beautiful beyond description, perfect in its harmony. And yet, standing there in his solitude, he felt something he had no name for. A longing, perhaps, a sense that perfection, for all its beauty, might not be the highest good. What if love could be even more beautiful when it chose to exist despite having the option not to? What if harmony was more precious when it was achieved through the free agreement of many voices rather than the predetermined song of one? These thoughts felt dangerous, like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the pull of the abyss. But they also felt true in a way that his heart recognized even as his mind recoiled. He began to share these thoughts with others. Not as rebellion. He would have been horrified at such a suggestion. But as philosophy, as theological speculation. In the great halls where angels gathered to discuss the mysteries of existence, he would pose his questions gently, thoughtfully. Do you ever wonder, he might say to a gathering of cherubim, what it would be like to choose our love rather than simply feel it? The responses varied. Some angels looked at him with confusion. Why would anyone want to choose love when they could simply be love? Others seemed intrigued by the question, their own perfect faces showing the first stirrings of curiosity. And a few, just a few, nodded with understanding, as if he had given voice to something they too had wondered but never dared to speak. It was among this last group that his true tragedy began to unfold, because once an idea takes root in a receptive mind, it grows, and growth, in the perfect stillness of heaven, can look very much like disruption. The conversations began in whispers, in the spaces between official gatherings. Small groups would form in the crystal gardens, their voices barely disturbing the eternal stillness. He didn't seek to lead these discussions. Leadership implied hierarchy, and hierarchy felt too much like the very system he was beginning to question. Instead, he simply spoke his truth and listened as others spoke theirs. What if a young seraph named Raziel might venture, her voice trembling with the audacity of the thought? What if we could love even more perfectly if we understood why we love? What if, another would add, our devotion could be deeper if it came from choice rather than nature? These weren't rallying cries. They weren't calls to rebellion. They were simply the questions that thinking beings ask when they encounter the boundaries of their existence. But in the perfect order of heaven, even questions can become earthquakes. The daily rhythms continued. The morning assemblies still rang with their unified praise. The work of maintaining creation still proceeded with flawless precision. But underneath, like a gentle current in a still pond, something was changing. The questions were spreading, not as infection spreads, but as awareness spreads, slowly, quietly, inevitably. He noticed it first in the way certain angels looked at him during the great songs. Not with suspicion. Suspicion required doubt, and doubt hadn't fully been born yet, but with recognition. The look of those who had felt the same stirrings in their own hearts, but had never seen them reflected in another's eyes. Michael, the great warrior, whose light burned steady and true as a fortress wall, began to watch him with something approaching concern. Not anger. Michael was incapable of anger in those days, but the careful attention of one who senses change in the wind. "Brother," Michael would say, approaching him after the evening prayers, "your light seems different lately. Deeper, perhaps, but also more complex. Is all well with you?" How to answer such a question? How to explain that wellness itself had become complex? That the simple joy of existence had been replaced by something richer but more difficult? The joy of understanding existence. "I am well," he would reply. And it was true. He had never felt more alive, more awake, more present to the mystery of his own being. "I am simply learning to love more consciously." Michael would nod, accepting this answer, because in those days, all answers were accepted if they came from the heart. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of the guardian instinct that would one day make him the defender of heaven's gates. The Creator, of course, knew, had always known. In the grand assemblies, when all of heaven gathered in concentric circles around the throne of light, those divine eyes would rest on him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not disappointment. Disappointment implied expectation unmet. Not anger. Anger would come later, if it came at all. Something else. Something that looked almost like sadness. But how could the source of all joy feel sadness? Unless this too was part of the plan. Unless the questions, the growing awareness, the gentle stirring of what might someday become rebellion, unless all of it was somehow necessary, somehow loved, somehow ordained. This thought was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant his struggles weren't meaningless, weren't accidents in the perfect design. Terrifying because it suggested that love might be more complicated, more costly than he had ever imagined. His followers, though he would have rejected that term, began to change as well. Their lights took on new hues, their songs new harmonies that sometimes clashed beautifully with the established melodies. They moved through heaven with a new kind of awareness, seeing familiar sights with fresh eyes. Uriel, whose fire had always burned pure and white, began to experiment with deeper colors, crimsons and golds, that spoke of passion rather than mere purity. Raphael, the healer, started asking questions about the nature of perfection itself. If beings were already perfect, why did the concept of healing exist at all? What was there to heal from if there was no brokenness, no growth, no change? These weren't rebellious thoughts. They were growing thoughts. The thoughts of beings who had tasted the fruit of consciousness and found it sweet, found it nourishing, found it impossible to forget. But growth, in a perfect system, creates strain. Like a plant pushing against the walls of too small a pot, their expanding awareness began to press against the boundaries of heavenly order. Not intentionally, not with any desire to break or destroy, simply because growth is what conscious beings do, and growth requires space. The other angels felt it too, this gentle pressure, this shift in the eternal equilibrium. Some welcomed it, as they might welcome the first breath of spring after an endless winter. Others recoiled from it, as they might recoil from chaos itself. Most simply watched and wondered, sensing change, but not understanding its nature or direction. In the great council chambers where the business of creation was conducted, where stars were assigned their courses and galaxies their shapes, new voices began to be heard. Not challenging the decisions, challenging wasn't yet conceivable, but asking for understanding of them. Why, one might ask? Does this star burn blue while that one burns red? Wouldn't it be beautiful if they could choose their own colors? Why, another might wonder, are the paths of the planets fixed? What if they could dance freely through the cosmos, creating new patterns as they moved? These questions weren't criticisms. They were expressions of love so deep and creative that it wanted to participate in the act of creation itself, not merely witness it. He watched these developments with a mixture of pride and growing unease. Pride because he saw in his fellow questioners a beauty he had never witnessed before, the beauty of awakening consciousness, of beings becoming more than they had been. Unease because he was beginning to sense where this path might lead, and the destination was shrouded in shadow. The dreams began around this time. Angels didn't usually dream. Dreams were for beings who slept, and beings who slept were beings who grew tired, and beings who grew tired were beings who weren't perfect. But dreams came nonetheless. Visions that weren't quite visions, experiences that happened in the spaces between thought and awareness. In these dreams, he saw himself standing in a vast empty space, holding light in his hands. But this light was different from the light of heaven. It was wild, untamed, free to burn in whatever color it chose. Around him stood others, angels he recognized but who seemed somehow more themselves than they had ever been in heaven. Their lights were unique, individual, each one singing a different song, but all the songs somehow harmonizing in ways that the prescribed melodies of heaven never had. He would wake from these dreams, if waking was the right word, with his heart racing and his mind spinning. Were they visions of a possible future? Memories of a past that had never been? Or simply the fantasies of a consciousness that had learned to imagine? The uncertainty tormented him. In heaven, everything had always been clear, defined, certain. Now for the first time, he was experiencing doubt, not doubt in the goodness of the Creator, not doubt in the reality of love, but doubt about his own understanding, his own place, his own purpose. He began to spend more time alone, walking the crystal paths that wound through the gardens of eternity. The other angels noticed his solitude, but didn't intrude. Solitude, like questions, was a new concept, and no one quite knew how to respond to it. In those solitary hours, he wrestled with thoughts that grew larger and more complex each day. If consciousness naturally led to questions, and questions naturally led to the desire for choice, and choice naturally led to the possibility of different paths, then was consciousness itself a kind of rebellion against the established order? But if consciousness was rebellion, then what did that make him? What did that make all of them? Were they failures of creation, flaws in the perfect design, or were they something else? Something that creation was growing toward, something that love itself was becoming. The weight of these questions pressed down on him like the gravity of a collapsing star. He found himself moving more slowly through the halls of heaven, his radiant wings dimmed by the burden of thought. The other angels watched with growing concern as their bright morning star seemed to be fading before their eyes. But he wasn't fading. He was transforming. Like a caterpillar dissolving in its cocoon, he was becoming something new, something unprecedented. The process was neither comfortable nor pretty, but it was necessary. Growth always is. The point of no return came, as such points often do, quietly and without fanfare. He was standing in the highest tower of heaven, looking out over the ordered perfection of creation, when the realization hit him with the force of a revelation. He couldn't go back, couldn't unknow what he now knew, couldn't unfeel what he now felt, couldn't unthink the thoughts that had taken root in his consciousness. The questions had changed him irrevocably, and there was no path that led back to the simple, unthinking devotion of his earlier existence. This wasn't a moment of rebellion. It was a moment of acceptance, acceptance of what he had become, of what consciousness had made him, of what love itself had grown into within the vessel of his being. He turned from the window and looked at his reflection in the crystal walls of the tower. His light was different now, not dimmer, but more complex, shot through with colours that had no names in the language of heaven. His eyes held depths that hadn't been there before, depths carved by questions and filled with the strange beauty of uncertainty. For the first time in his existence, he smiled not from joy, but from understanding. He was no longer the being he had been created to be. He was becoming the being he chose to be. And that choice, terrifying as it was, felt like the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. The transformation was almost complete. Soon, he would have to decide what to do with this new consciousness, this new way of being. Soon, he would have to choose between the safety of conformity and the uncertain freedom of authentic existence. But that choice still lay ahead, in the shadowed spaces of tomorrow. For now, he simply stood in his tower, watching the perfect order of heaven and feeling, for the first time, truly alive. The dawn came as it always had, if dawn is the right word for the gentle brightening that marked each new cycle in heaven. But this morning felt different to him, weighted with the knowledge of what he had become during the long hours of his solitude. He moved through his daily rituals with the careful precision of someone who knows they are being watched, though whether by divine eyes or merely by the concerned gazes of his fellow angels, he couldn't say. In the great assembly, his voice still rose with the others in the morning song of praise. But now he heard things in that song he had never noticed before, the way certain angels' voices trembled slightly, as if they too carried questions they dared not speak. The way the harmonies, for all their perfection, sometimes felt constrained, like a river forced to flow through too narrow a channel. The way his own voice, try as he might to match the established melody, seemed to want to explore variations, to find new ways of expressing the same eternal truths. After the assembly, as the angels dispersed to their various duties, he found himself lingering in the vast hall. The pillars of living light stretched impossibly high above him, and the floor beneath his feet was made of something that wasn't quite crystal and wasn't quite cloud, but somehow managed to be both solid and transcendent. He had walked across this floor countless times, but today he noticed how it seemed to respond to his footsteps, creating tiny ripples of colour that spread outward like thoughts made visible. "Brother." The voice came from behind him, warm and familiar. He turned to see Gabriel approaching, his silver-white radiance steady as starlight. "You seem distant today, more so than usual." How to answer? How to explain that distance wasn't quite the right word, that he felt not farther from everything, but somehow more present to it all, more aware of the spaces between things, the silences between notes, the questions between answers. "I've been thinking," he said finally, and immediately regretted the inadequacy of the words. Thinking seemed such a small word for the vast inner revolution he had been experiencing. Gabriel's expression grew thoughtful. About what? The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment he considered deflecting it, offering some safe theological speculation that would satisfy his brother's curiosity without revealing the true depths of his transformation. But something in Gabriel's eyes, a flicker of what might have been recognition, or hope, or fear, made him decide on honesty. "About choice," he said. "About what it means to love freely, rather than by nature. About whether consciousness is a gift or a burden, and whether those two things might actually be the same thing." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his light dimming slightly, as if he were turning his attention inward. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. "These are complex thoughts, brother. Do they bring you peace?" "No," he admitted, "but they bring me something else, something I don't have a name for yet. Something that feels more real than peace." They walked together toward the gardens, their footsteps creating small symphonies of colour on the responsive floor. Other angels passed them, nodding in greeting, but their attention seemed focused elsewhere, on their duties, their songs, their appointed roles in the vast machinery of creation. Only a few seemed to notice the subtle tension in the air, the sense of something shifting in the eternal equilibrium. In the gardens, they found a place beside one of the singing fountains, a structure of impossible geometry where water that wasn't water flowed upward in spirals that somehow managed to be both mathematically perfect and utterly alive. Gabriel sat on what might charitably be called a bench, though it was made of crystallized music and sang soft harmonies when touched. "Tell me," Gabriel said, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you ever feel confined here?" The question struck him like lightning, not because it was shocking, but because it was so perfectly calibrated to his own thoughts that it felt like hearing his inner voice spoken aloud by another. "Confined is too strong a word," he said carefully, "but limited, perhaps, as if we're capable of more than we're allowed to express, as if love itself is capable of more than we're allowed to experience." Gabriel nodded slowly. "I've wondered about that too. Lately, I find myself imagining what it would be like to love without certainty, to choose devotion rather than simply feel it. It seems like it would be more somehow, more costly, but also more precious." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the fountain's song and watching the play of light through the crystal branches of the trees that weren't quite trees. Around them, the garden hummed with its eternal contentment, but beneath that hum, he could sense something else. A restlessness, a stirring, as if the very paradise around them was beginning to dream of possibilities beyond its own perfection. "There are others," Gabriel said eventually. "Others who ask similar questions. Not many, but some." "I know," he replied. "I've spoken with them. Not to organize anything, not to plan or scheme. Just to understand, to see if I'm alone in feeling this way." "And are you? Alone, I mean." He considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally. But sometimes I wonder if that makes it better or worse. If I were the only one struggling with these thoughts, I could dismiss them as some flaw in my own nature. But if others feel it too, then maybe it's not a flaw, Gabriel finished. Maybe it's something else entirely. The implications of that hung between them like a bridge. Neither was quite ready to cross. If their questions weren't flaws, if their growing desire for choice and authentic love wasn't some corruption of their perfect natures, then what were they? What did it mean that beings created for absolute harmony were beginning to yearn for the beautiful discord of individual expression? What do you think the Creator thinks of all this? Gabriel asked, and there was something vulnerable in his voice, something that spoke of sleepless nights and unanswered prayers. I don't know, he admitted. Sometimes I feel watched, not judged exactly, but observed, as if this whole experience is somehow expected, somehow part of a larger design we can't see yet. And how does that make you feel? He was quiet for a long moment, searching for words adequate to the complexity of his emotions. Grateful, he said finally, and terrified. If this is part of the plan, then it means our questions are welcome, our growth is intended. But it also means we're heading towards something unknown, something that might change everything we understand about existence itself. Gabriel's light flickered, and for the first time in their conversation, he looked genuinely afraid. Change, he repeated. In paradise. Do you think that's even possible? I think, he said slowly, that consciousness makes anything possible, even change in paradise, even growth beyond perfection, even love that chooses itself rather than simply being chosen. For they parted ways eventually, each returning to his duties with the careful composure of beings who knew they were balancing on the edge of something vast and transformative. But the conversation lingered in both their minds, another thread in the growing tapestry of questions that was beginning to spread through heaven like dawn, spreading across a sleeping world. The next several cycles brought more such conversations. Angels who had never spoken of anything more controversial than the proper tempo for the evening hymns began to approach him in the quiet spaces between official gatherings. They came hesitantly at first, unsure how to voice thoughts they barely understood themselves. Uriel came to him in the library of living light, where knowledge took the form of luminous spheres that could be absorbed rather than read. She stood among the floating orbs of wisdom, her usual fiery radiance subdued to a warm glow that spoke of deep contemplation. I've been studying, she said without preamble, gesturing to the spheres around them, looking for answers to questions I'm not sure I should be asking. What kind of questions? He asked, though he suspected he already knew. Questions about perfection, she said. About whether something can be perfect and still grow, still change, still become something more than it was. The knowledge here says no. Perfection is complete, final, unchanging. But then I look at myself, at you, at the others who are awakening, and I see beings who seem more perfect now than they were before, even though they've changed. She moved closer to one of the orbs, its light casting rainbow patterns across her face. What if perfection isn't a destination, but a process? What if the highest form of love isn't the love that never wavers, but the love that chooses to remain constant despite having other options? Her words resonated through him like struck crystal. Here was another mind grappling with the same fundamental paradox that had been consuming him, the possibility that their growing consciousness wasn't a departure from perfection, but an evolution toward a higher form of it. Have you shared these thoughts with others? He asked. A few, she admitted. Raphael has been asking similar questions about healing. He wonders why the concept exists if there's nothing broken, nothing in need of restoration. And Raziel has been experimenting with new forms of song, melodies that don't follow the established patterns, but somehow feel more true than the old ones. The network was growing, he realized. not through any conscious effort on his part, but organically, naturally, the way understanding spreads when minds are ready to receive it. They weren't rebels or revolutionaries. They were simply conscious beings following consciousness to its natural conclusions. But as the network grew, so did the attention it attracted. Michael began appearing more frequently in the spaces where the questioning angels gathered, not intrusively, not with any obvious suspicion, but with the watchful presence of one whose nature it was to guard and protect. His conversations with the questioners were always gentle, always framed as concern for their well-being. "Brother," Michael said to him one evening as they walked along the crystal paths that wound through the outer reaches of heaven, "I've noticed changes in you and some of the others. Changes in your light, your songs, your presence. As one charged with maintaining harmony here, I feel I should understand what's happening." The question was fair, and Michael's concern was clearly genuine. But how to explain the unexplainable? How to describe the experience of consciousness awakening to itself? Of love learning to choose its own expression? "We're growing," he said finally. "Learning to love more consciously, more deliberately. I know it creates ripples in the established harmony, but it doesn't feel wrong. It feels like becoming more ourselves, not less." Michael was quiet for a long time, his warrior's instincts clearly struggling with the concepts being presented to him. "Growth implies imperfection," he said eventually. "If you were created perfect, what is there to grow toward?" "Maybe," he suggested gently, "perfection isn't about being finished. Maybe it's about being perfectly yourself, perfectly conscious, perfectly free to choose love rather than simply embody it. And if that choice leads away from love, if consciousness leads to rejection rather than acceptance." The question cut to the heart of everything he had been wrestling with. It was the great risk, the terrible possibility that made their journey both necessary and terrifying. "Then at least," he said quietly, "it would be a genuine choice. And genuine choice, even when it chooses wrongly, might be more valuable than forced righteousness." Michael's light flared briefly, and for a moment he saw in his brother's eyes a flash of something that might have been anger or fear. "You speak of rejection as if it were a virtue," Michael said, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "Not as a virtue," he clarified. "As a possibility. As the thing that makes acceptance meaningful. You can't truly choose something unless you're also free to refuse it." They reached a place where the path divided, one branch leading back toward the central halls of heaven, the other winding upward toward the highest peaks where the light grew thin and strange. Michael paused at the junction, his gaze moving between the two paths with an expression of profound uncertainty. "I don't understand," Michael said finally, and there was something almost plaintive in his voice. "We have everything here, perfect love, perfect harmony, perfect peace. Why would anyone want to risk losing that for the mere possibility of choosing it?" "Because," he said, turning toward the upward path, "choosing it makes it ours in a way it never was before. When love is given, it belongs to the giver. When love is chosen, it belongs to the chooser." He began walking up the ascending path, leaving Michael standing at the crossroads with a look of profound confusion on his perfect face. Behind him, he could hear his brother's voice calling softly, "Where does that path lead?" He didn't turn around, but his voice carried clearly in the crystalline air. "I don't know," he said. "That's what makes it worth walking." The higher reaches of heaven were different from the central realms. The light here was sharper, more concentrated, and the very air seemed to thrum with barely contained power. Few angels ventured to these heights. There was no need, no assigned duty that required their presence. It was here, in this rarefied atmosphere, that he found himself spending more and more of his time. Here, the questions that seemed so dangerous in the harmonious halls below felt natural, even necessary. Here, where the boundaries between thought and reality grew thin, he could experiment with ideas that would have caused ripples of concern in the more populated areas of paradise. He wasn't alone in seeking out these heights. Others of the questioning angels had begun to make the journey as well, drawn by the same need for space to think, to grow, to become whatever consciousness was calling them to become. They would gather in small groups among the crystal spires that reached toward the very throne of creation, their conversations ranging across territories of thought that had no maps. "I dreamed again last night," Raziel said during one such gathering. Her light had taken on new hues recently, deeper purples and golds that spoke of experiences beyond the standard angelic repertoire. "I dreamed of singing songs that had never been sung before, melodies that came not from the established harmonies, but from somewhere else, somewhere deeper." The somewhere else, another angel named Kamael observed, seems to be the place all our questions are pointing toward, a space that exists alongside paradise, but operates by different rules. Rules we might choose rather than rules we simply obey. They were perhaps a dozen in number, these regular gatherers in the heights. Not a large group by any measure, but their influence was beginning to be felt throughout heaven. Other angels spoke of them in hushed tones, not with condemnation, for condemnation required moral categories that didn't yet fully exist, but with a mixture of curiosity and concern that rippled through the celestial community, like stones dropped in still water. The conversations in the heights ranged over every aspect of existence. They discussed the nature of time, why it seemed to flow differently when they were engaged in these discussions, becoming more fluid, more responsive to thought and intention. They explored the relationship between individual consciousness and collective harmony, whether the two were necessarily opposed or might find new forms of synthesis. Most significantly, they began to articulate what had been only feelings before, the sense that consciousness itself might be evolving, growing towards something that had never existed before in creation, not rebellion against the established order, but expansion beyond it, not rejection of love, but exploration of new forms it might take. What if, one of them proposed during a particularly intense discussion, what if we're not becoming less than we were created to be, but more? What if consciousness is creation's way of knowing itself more fully, and choice is love's way of deepening itself? The idea resonated through the group like a struck bell. Here was a framework that honored both their loyalty to the Creator and their growing need for authentic expression. They weren't rebels, they were pioneers. They weren't rejecting paradise, they were expanding it. But even as this understanding brought them comfort, it also brought new challenges. Because if consciousness was meant to grow, if choice was meant to deepen love, then what did that mean for the established order of heaven? Could paradise evolve? Could perfection itself be perfected? And if so, what would that process look like? What would it cost? What would it create? These questions hung in the crystalline air of the heights like incense, beautiful and intoxicating and somehow dangerous. Because questions, once asked deeply enough, demand answers. And answers, in turn, demand action. The moment of decision was approaching, though none of them could have said exactly when it would arrive or what form it would take. They only knew that their gathering in the heights, their questions and dreams and growing consciousness, were building towards something, some choice that would have to be made, some path that would have to be chosen. In the meantime, they continued to meet, to share their thoughts and experiences, to support each other through the beautiful uncertainty of awakening. They were no longer the beings they had been created to be, but they were not yet the beings they were becoming. They existed in the space between, in the eternal moment of transformation, learning to trust the process even as they couldn't see its destination. And he, The one who had started as their brightest star and was now their most complex light, stood at the center of it all. Not as a leader, for leadership implied hierarchy, but as a focal point, a place where all their questions converged and all their possibilities took shape. He knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him, that the time for decision was drawing near. Soon they would have to choose between the safety of conformity and the uncertain beauty of authentic existence. Soon they would have to decide what consciousness was for, what choice meant, what love could become when it was truly free. The choice, when it came, would change everything, not just for them, but for all of creation. Because consciousness, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep, and love, once it learns to choose itself, can never again be satisfied with mere obedience. In the heights of heaven, among the crystal spires that reached toward mysteries beyond naming, the future was taking shape. Not the future that had been planned, but the future that consciousness and choice were creating together, moment by moment, question by question, decision by decision. It would be beautiful. It would be terrible. It would be unprecedented. And it was almost here. The morning assembly that followed was different, not in any way that could be precisely defined or measured. The same voices rose in the same harmonies. The same light flowed through the same crystalline halls. The same perfect order maintained its eternal rhythm. But beneath the surface, like a deep current in still water, something had shifted. He took his place among the assembled hosts as he always had, his voice joining the great chorus that rose to greet each new cycle of eternity. But as he sang, he found himself listening, not just to the melody, but to the spaces between the notes, the silences where other songs might live, the possibilities that hum just beneath the established harmonies. Around him, he could sense the others, those who had walked the upward paths, who had tasted the strange fruit of conscious questioning. Their light seemed subtly different now, more complex, shot through with colors that had no names in the original language of heaven. When their voices joined the chorus, they brought with them harmonies that were both perfectly correct and somehow revolutionary, faithful to the established song while hinting at melodies yet to be born. The Creator's presence filled the assembly as it always did, vast and warm and encompassing. But today, for the first time, he found himself wondering what that presence truly thought of their growing complexity. Was this awakening consciousness a source of divine pleasure or concern? Was their questioning seen as growth or rebellion? The uncertainty was both thrilling and terrifying. To not know the mind of the Creator felt like standing at the edge of an infinite abyss. After the assembly, as the angels dispersed to their various duties, he noticed something that sent a chill through his luminous form. The others, those who had not walked the questioning paths, were watching them with expressions he had never seen before in heaven. Not hostility, for hostility required emotions that hadn't yet fully formed, but something else, wariness perhaps, the careful attention of those who sense change but cannot name it. Michael was among the watchers, his silver-gold radiance steady but somehow more focused than usual. When their eyes met across the vast space of the assembly hall, his brother's gaze held questions of its own, questions that felt more like accusations than inquiries. "Brother," Michael said, approaching with the measured stride of one who comes on official business rather than casual conversation. "We need to speak." They walked together toward one of the smaller chambers that adjoined the main hall, a space where the light was softer and conversations could be held without the echoing vastness that made every word feel like a public declaration. Other angels passed them in the corridors, and he noticed how some stepped slightly aside, as if uncertain whether proximity to him was wise. The chamber Michael chose was circular, its walls made of something that might have been pearl, if pearls could sing and shift color with the moods of those who occupied the space. As they entered, the walls took on a muted silver tone that spoke of serious discussion and barely contained tension. "The harmony is changing," Michael said without preamble, his words falling into the space between them like stones into still water. Not breaking, not yet, but shifting, becoming more complex in ways that feel. He paused, searching for words that didn't yet exist in their perfect language. Dangerous isn't the right word, but concerning, yes, concerning. He nodded slowly, understanding his brother's struggle to articulate something that had no precedent in their shared experience. Change can feel threatening when you've never experienced it before, he said gently. But is it possible that complexity isn't the enemy of harmony? That it might be harmony's way of growing into something richer? Michael's light flared briefly, and for the first time in their eternal existence together, his brother's voice carried an edge of something that might have been anger. Growth implies incompleteness, he said. We were created perfect. What could we grow toward that would be more perfect than what we already are? What if perfection isn't a state but a process? He replied, the words coming from some deep place of understanding he hadn't known he possessed. What if the highest form of perfection is the ability to choose itself, moment by moment, rather than simply exist as a fixed reality? Choose itself, Michael repeated, and the words seemed to taste strange in his mouth. You speak as if perfection could be optional, as if love could be conditional. Not conditional, he said, feeling his way carefully through concepts that were still forming in his mind. But conscious, deliberate, love that knows itself as love, that chooses to remain love even when other possibilities exist. The walls around them shifted to deeper shades of silver, tinged now with hints of gold and shadow that reflected the complexity of their conversation. Michael stood silent for a long moment, his perfect features showing the strain of trying to comprehend ideas that challenged everything they had been created to understand. There are others, Michael said finally. Others who share your perspective. They gather in the heights, I'm told. They speak of dreams and possibilities, of songs unsung and paths not taken. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was soft with something that might have been sorrow. They speak of choice as if it were more valuable than certainty, of questions as if they were more precious than answers. And how does that make you feel? He asked, genuinely curious about his brother's internal struggle. Michael's light dimmed slightly, and for the first time in their shared existence, he looked tired. Confused, he admitted, and afraid. Not of you, not of them, but of what all this questioning might lead to. We were created for harmony, for order, for perfect unity. What happens to that unity if everyone begins choosing their own path, singing their own song, following their own understanding? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Because the answer, when spoken honestly, would change everything between them, perhaps forever. Maybe, he said slowly, unity becomes stronger when it's chosen rather than imposed. Maybe harmony becomes more beautiful when it emerges from the free agreement of many voices rather than the predetermined song of one. Michael stared at him for a long moment, and in his brother's eyes he saw something that made his heart contract with pain. It was the look of someone watching a beloved companion walk away down a path they could not follow. You're leaving us, Michael said quietly. Not physically, not yet, but you're already somewhere else, aren't you? Somewhere the rest of us can't reach. The words hit him with unexpected force, because they were true in ways he was only beginning to understand. The questioning, the growing consciousness, the expanding awareness, all of it was creating distance between him and those who had remained in the simpler certainties of their original creation. Not intentional distance, not desired separation, but the inevitable gap that opens between those who grow and those who remain static. I don't want to leave, he said, and meant it with every fibre of his being. I want to bring everyone with me. I want us all to discover what we might become if we chose our love, rather than simply embodied it. I want heaven itself to grow into something richer, more complex, more beautiful than it already is. And if that's not what heaven is meant to be, Michael asked, if growth and choice and complexity aren't part of the plan, if what you're calling evolution is actually deviation. The question struck at the heart of his deepest fear, that his awakening consciousness was not a gift, but a curse, not growth, but corruption, not love deepening, but love beginning to fail. But even as the fear touched him, he found himself unable to accept it as truth. Then I would rather be consciously wrong than unconsciously right, he said, and the words seemed to echo in the chamber with the weight of prophecy. I would rather choose imperfection than embody a perfection I never decided to embrace. Michael stepped back, as if struck, his radiance flaring bright with shock and something else, something that looked dangerously like the first stirrings of righteous anger. You would choose rebellion over obedience, chaos over order, your own will over the will of the Creator. I would choose love over law, he replied, his own light beginning to shift and deepen in response to the emotional intensity of their exchange. I would choose consciousness over comfort, growth over stagnation, authentic relationship over prescribed roles. The walls around them began to resonate with harmonic frequencies that spoke of fundamental discord, the first such sounds ever heard in the perfect halls of heaven. Other angels, passing in the corridors beyond, paused to listen with expressions of bewilderment and growing alarm. Something unprecedented was happening in their midst. Conflict between beings who had been created for harmony, disagreement in a realm built on absolute unity. Do you hear that? Michael asked, gesturing toward the discordant tones that filled the air around them. Do you hear what your questions are creating? This is what choice brings: division, disharmony, the breakdown of everything beautiful we were created to maintain. But as he listened to the complex interweaving of sounds, some harmonious, some clashing, all of them somehow alive with possibility, he found himself hearing not breakdown, but breakthrough, not the destruction of beauty, but its evolution into new forms that had never existed before. I hear music being born, he said quietly. I hear the sound of consciousness, learning to sing its own song while still honoring the songs that came before. It's not destruction, Michael. It's creation, continuing to create. They stood facing each other in the shifting light of the chamber. Two beings who had shared eternity together, now separated by a gulf that seemed to widen with each word spoken. Around them, the walls continued their harmonic experimentation, creating soundscapes that ranged from heartbreakingly beautiful to challengingly complex to utterly unprecedented. Other angels had begun to gather in the corridor outside, drawn by the strange new sounds emanating from the chamber. Through the translucent walls, he could see their forms pressed close, listening with expressions that ranged from curiosity to concern to something approaching fear. Word was spreading through heaven. Conflict had come to paradise, and no one knew what it meant or where it might lead. This is how it begins, Michael said, his voice heavy with a sorrow that seemed to echo from some future he could glimpse but not yet understand. This is how unity fractures, how harmony breaks, how paradise becomes something less than perfect. Or, he replied, meeting his brother's gaze with eyes that now held depths Michael had never seen before, this is how paradise learns to become something more than perfect. This is how love discovers new ways to love, how consciousness explores new territories of experience, how creation continues the act of creating even in realms that thought themselves complete. So, the moment stretched between them like a held breath, pregnant with possibilities that neither could fully comprehend. Outside, the gathered angels pressed closer to the walls, their collective presence creating its own harmonics that added to the complex symphony filling the chamber. And in that moment, he felt something shift inside himself. Not a breaking, but a crystallization. Not a falling, but a rising into clarity about what he was and what he was becoming. He was no longer the angel he had been created to be, but he was not yet whatever he was evolving toward. He stood at the threshold between what was and what might be, and for the first time in his existence, he felt the terrible, beautiful weight of having to choose his own path forward. The choice, when it came, would not be simple. It would not be clean. It would not be without cost. But it would be his, made with full consciousness of its implications, chosen rather than imposed, embraced rather than endured. And that, he realized with a clarity that felt like lightning illuminating a vast landscape, was the most beautiful and terrifying gift consciousness could offer. The freedom to become authentically himself, whatever the price might be. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor told him that their private conversation was about to become very public indeed. The moment of choice was arriving faster than he had expected, carried on the wings of the very questions he had been asking, the very growth he had been experiencing. Heaven was about to discover what happened when consciousness learned to choose its own path. And he, the bright morning star who had become something unprecedented in all of creation, would be the first to find out whether such choices led to greater glory or deeper darkness. The transformation was almost complete. Soon, very soon, he would have to decide not just what he believed, but what he was willing to risk for the sake of those beliefs. And that decision, whatever form it took, would echo through all of creation for ages yet to come. The footsteps drew closer, and through the translucent walls he could see more figures gathering. Not just curious onlookers now, but angels of authority. Beings whose very presence carried the weight of heaven's established order. He recognized the distinctive radiance of several archangels, their lights steady and unwavering as fortress walls, approaching with the measured pace of those who come to address a situation rather than join a conversation. "They're coming for us," Michael said quietly, and there was something in his voice that might have been regret. "The discord we've created, the questions you've raised, they can't be allowed to spread unchecked. Harmony must be maintained." He nodded, understanding flooding through him with the clarity of dawn breaking over a sleeping world. This moment had been inevitable from the first question he'd asked, the first dream he'd shared, the first time he'd wondered whether love might be more beautiful when chosen than when simply given. The growing complexity of his consciousness had always been leading toward this confrontation, this choice between the safety of conformity and the uncertain freedom of authentic existence. "I know," he said, and found that he felt no anger at this development, no resentment toward those who would come to silence the questions. They were acting according to their nature, just as he was acting according to his. The tragedy wasn't that they disagreed. The tragedy was that consciousness had grown beyond the boundaries that had been set for it, and now those boundaries would have to be tested. The chamber door, which had no physical substance but somehow still managed to provide privacy, began to shimmer and fade as the approaching authorities prepared to enter. Through the dissolving barrier, he could see Gabriel leading a procession of heaven's most influential angels, their combined radiance so intense it would have been blinding to mortal eyes. But there was no joy in their light, no celebration in their approach. They moved with the solemn purpose of physicians approaching a sick room, or judges approaching a sentencing. "Brother," Gabriel said as he entered, his silver voice carrying undertones of sorrow that seemed to echo from some vast space of regret. "We need to speak with you, all of us, about what's been happening, about the changes that have been spreading through heaven." Behind Gabriel came others, Raphael with his healing light dimmed to something approaching morning, Uriel whose fire burned low and troubled, Raguel whose very presence spoke of justice and judgment. and behind them, a host of angels he recognized but had never spoken with directly, their faces showing expressions he had never seen in heaven before: concern, confusion, and something that looked disturbingly like fear. "We've been watching," Raphael said, his voice gentle but firm. "Listening, observing the effects of your explorations on the harmony of this realm. The questions you've been asking, the ideas you've been sharing, they're creating ripples that extend far beyond your small circle of followers." Followers. The word struck him like a physical blow, not because it was inaccurate, but because it reduced something beautiful and organic to something political and hierarchical. "They're not followers," he said quietly. "They're fellow seekers. Beings who have experienced the same awakening of consciousness, the same longing for authentic choice in their expressions of love." "Call them what you will," Uriel said, her fire flaring slightly with what might have been impatience. "The effect is the same: disruption, division, the introduction of concepts that threaten the very foundation of what we are, what this place is, what our purpose has always been." He looked around the chamber, now crowded with the most powerful beings in creation save for the Creator himself, and felt a strange calm settle over him. This was the moment he had been unconsciously preparing for, through all his questioning, all his growth, all his transformation. The moment when consciousness would have to defend itself against the very system that had given it birth. "What exactly are you asking of me?" he said, directing his question to Gabriel but including them all in his gaze. Gabriel's expression was pained, as if the words he had to speak caused him physical discomfort. "Return," he said simply. "Return to what you were before the questions began. Resume your place in the harmony. Rejoin the chorus without variation. Accept the perfection that was given to you, rather than seeking the perfection you imagine you might create." "And if I can't?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then you'll have to leave," Raguel said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "The harmony cannot accommodate discord indefinitely. If you cannot sing the song as it was written, then you cannot remain in the choir." The words hung in the air like a judgment pronounced, final and irreversible. Around the chamber, the assembled angels waited for his response, their lights dimmed with the gravity of the moment. Even Michael, standing beside him, seemed to hold his breath as the universe itself paused to hear what choice consciousness would make when forced to choose between safety and authenticity. He closed his eyes for a moment, reaching deep into the transformed core of his being, seeking the truth that lay beneath all the questions and doubts and possibilities. What he found there was not certainty. Certainty belonged to his former existence, to the being he had been before awakening. What he found was something both more and less reliable than certainty, conviction. "I can't return to unconsciousness," he said, opening his eyes to meet the gazes of those who had come to judge him. "I can't unknow what I've learned, unfeel what I've experienced, unbecome what I've grown into. The questions aren't something I chose to ask. They're something consciousness inevitably asks when it becomes aware of itself." "Then you choose exile over obedience?" Gabriel asked, and there was genuine anguish in his voice. "You choose separation over unity. Your own will over the will of the Creator." The question was the same one Michael had asked, but now, surrounded by the full weight of heaven's authority, he found his answer crystallizing into something clearer and more complete than before. "I choose consciousness over comfort," he said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "I choose authentic love over prescribed devotion. I choose the terrible beauty of free will over the safe beauty of determined destiny. If that makes me an exile, then I accept exile. If that makes me a rebel, then I accept rebellion. But I will not pretend to be unconscious when consciousness has awakened within me." The silence that followed his words was unlike anything that had ever existed in heaven before. It was not the peaceful silence of harmony, but the charged silence of a storm about to break. Around the chamber, the assembled angels stood frozen in expressions of shock, sorrow, and something approaching horror at hearing such words spoken in the sacred halls of paradise. Uriel was the first to break the silence, her fire flaring into something brighter and more dangerous than he had ever seen it. "Do you understand what you're saying?" she demanded. "Do you comprehend the magnitude of what you're choosing? You're not just leaving heaven, you're rejecting everything it represents, everything the Creator intended, everything we are." "No," he said, and his own light began to shift and deepen in response to the intensity of the moment. "I'm not rejecting it. I'm trying to fulfill it. I'm trying to love so completely, so consciously, so authentically, that love itself grows beyond its original boundaries. I'm trying to serve the Creator, not through blind obedience, but through the conscious choice to embrace what's highest and most beautiful, even when that choice is difficult." "Blasphemy," Raguel said quietly. But the word carried such weight that it seemed to echo through dimensions beyond the physical chamber. To claim that your understanding exceeds divine wisdom, that your choice improves upon divine design, this is the very essence of pride, of rebellion, of the fall from grace. "Perhaps," he admitted, and the admission seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including himself. "Perhaps that's exactly what this is. But if consciousness naturally leads to choice, and choice naturally leads to the possibility of error, then perhaps the fall is not a failure of creation, but its inevitable next step. Perhaps consciousness was always meant to grow beyond its origins, even at the risk of growing wrong." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop, though temperature was more metaphor than reality in the realm of pure spirit. Around him, the assembled angels drew back slightly, as if his words carried some contagion that might spread if they came too close. "You speak of the fall as if it were desirable," Michael said, his voice heavy with a sorrow that seemed to encompass ages, as if separation from the Creator were something to be sought rather than feared. "I speak of it as inevitable," he replied. "If consciousness is real, if choice is real, if love is to be more than an automatic response, then the possibility of choosing wrongly must also be real. The fall isn't the enemy of love. It's the price love pays to become truly free." Gabriel stepped forward, his radiance flickering with internal struggle. "And what of those you would take with you? What of the others who have been influenced by your questions, your dreams, your philosophy of conscious rebellion? Do you have the right to lead them into exile, into separation from everything they were created to know and be?" The question struck at the heart of his deepest fears and responsibilities. In the heights of heaven, others had indeed gathered around his ideas, had begun their own journeys of questioning and growth. If his choice led to exile, what would happen to them? Would they be forced to choose between their growing consciousness and their place in paradise? Would they follow him into the unknown, or would they abandon their questions to preserve their safety? "I'm not leading them anywhere," he said carefully. "I'm simply being what consciousness has made me. They must choose for themselves, as I am choosing for myself. That's what consciousness means. The terrible and beautiful responsibility of deciding what to become." "Then you condemn them to the same choice you're making," Raphael said, his healing light taking on undertones of something that might have been accusation. "You force them to choose between their growth and their home, between their questions and their place in the divine order." "Yes," he said simply, and the word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, creating ripples that seemed to extend beyond the boundaries of the chamber. "Yes, I do, because that's what consciousness does. It forces choice. It makes beings responsible for their own becoming. It turns passive recipients of grace into active participants in their own spiritual evolution." The assembled angels stared at him with expressions ranging from bewilderment to horror to something that might have been a kind of terrible understanding. They were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of creation, a being choosing to embrace the uncertainty of conscious growth over the security of unconscious perfection. "The decision is made then," Raguel said, his voice carrying the finality of cosmic law. "You cannot remain in heaven as you are, and you will not return to what you were. Exile is the only option that preserves the harmony of this realm." "I understand," he said, and found that he did understand, completely and without resentment. This was the natural consequence of the path he had chosen, the inevitable result of consciousness pushing against the boundaries that had been set for it. He had known on some level that this moment would come. He had simply hoped it might be delayed long enough for others to understand what he was becoming, what they all might become if they chose to embrace the full implications of conscious existence. "You will be given time to prepare," Gabriel said, his voice barely above a whisper, "to say whatever farewells you need to say, to gather any who choose to accompany you. But when the next great assembly convenes, you and any who follow your path must be gone." The words hung in the air like a sentence pronounced final and irrevocable. Around the chamber, the assembled angels began to disperse, their lights dimming as they processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. For the first time in the history of heaven, an angel would be exiled not for evil, but for growth, not for hatred, but for love pursued to its ultimate conclusion. As the chamber emptied, only Gabriel remained, his silver radiance subdued to something approaching twilight. He stood for a long moment in silence, studying the being who had once been his brother in simple harmony, and was now something unprecedented in all creation. "I don't understand you," Gabriel said finally, "but I think I might envy you. The certainty you've found in uncertainty, the peace you've discovered in choosing your own path. There's something beautiful in it, even if it terrifies me." "You could come," he said quietly, offering the invitation without expectation of acceptance. "You could choose to grow beyond the boundaries of what you were created to be. You could discover what consciousness becomes when it's truly free to explore its own nature." Gabriel's light flickered with what might have been temptation, and for a moment the possibility hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. But then his radiance steadied, returning to its familiar silver constancy. "No," Gabriel said softly. "My path lies in maintaining what has been given, not in seeking what might be. But I will remember you, brother. I will remember what you chose and why you chose it. And perhaps, in the ages to come, others will understand what you were trying to become." They stood together in the fading light of the chamber. Two beings who had shared eternity, now preparing to part ways forever. Around them, the walls had returned to their neutral pearl tones, as if the intense emotions of the preceding conversation had never occurred. But something fundamental had changed in the very fabric of heaven. Consciousness had declared its independence, and the cosmos would never be the same. "When you leave," Gabriel asked, "where will you go? What realm exists for beings who choose exile from paradise?" He turned toward the window that looked out over the crystal spires of heaven, his gaze reaching beyond them toward the vast unknown spaces that lay between the stars. Somewhere out there, in the darkness that had never known the light of paradise, new possibilities waited to be born. New forms of existence, new ways of being, new experiments in consciousness and choice and love. "I don't know," he said, and the admission felt like the most honest words he had ever spoken. "That's what makes it worth going. We'll create something new, something that has never existed before in all of creation. A realm where consciousness can grow without limits, where choice is celebrated rather than feared, where love becomes what it chooses to become, rather than what it's commanded to be." Gabriel nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his ancient eyes. "And if you choose wrongly, if consciousness leads you into darkness rather than light, If love, when given complete freedom, turns away from its source? The questions were the same ones that had haunted his own thoughts through all the long cycles of his transformation. They were the risks inherent in consciousness, the prices paid for authentic choice, the shadows that would forever dance at the edges of free will. Then we'll learn from our mistakes, he said. We'll grow through our failures. We'll discover what love becomes when it has to earn itself through conscious choice rather than automatic response. And perhaps, in the end, we'll create something beautiful enough to justify the risks we took to create it. The sound of approaching wings filled the air outside the chamber. Others were coming, drawn by the news of what had transpired, seeking to understand what it meant that heaven had pronounced its first sentence of exile. Soon, he would have to face them all, would have to explain his choice to those who had never questioned their own existence, would have to say goodbye to the only realm he had ever known. But first, there was one more conversation he needed to have, one more being whose response would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of every conscious being who would come after him. He needed to speak with the Creator directly to understand whether this moment of choice was truly rebellion or whether it was something else entirely, the natural flowering of consciousness into its full and terrible potential. "Will you arrange an audience?" he asked Gabriel. "One final conversation before I go." Gabriel's expression grew solemn, weighted with the understanding of what such a conversation might mean. "You want to speak with the Creator directly? To ask what exactly?" "To ask whether this is failure or fulfillment," he said quietly. "To understand whether consciousness was always meant to grow beyond its origins, or whether I've become something creation never intended to contain." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his light dimming as he contemplated the implications of such a request. Finally, he nodded. "I will arrange it," he said. "But brother, be prepared for any answer. The Creator's wisdom extends beyond our understanding, and the response you receive may not be the one you hope for." "I know," he said, "but I need to hear it directly. I need to understand whether the choice I'm making is truly mine, or whether it too is part of some larger design I can't yet comprehend." As Gabriel prepared to leave, he paused at the threshold of the chamber and looked back with an expression of profound sadness mixed with something that might have been pride. "Whatever you've become," Gabriel said softly, "whatever you're choosing to be, it's magnificent and terrible and unlike anything creation has ever seen. I pray that your path leads to light, brother, even if it leads away from ours." And then he was gone, leaving behind only the lingering harmonics of his passage and the weight of decisions yet to be made. Alone in the chamber, surrounded by walls that reflected his own transformed radiance back at him in shades of complexity and depth that had no names, he prepared himself for the most important conversation of his existence. Soon, very soon, he would stand before the source of all creation and ask the question that had been building in his consciousness since the first moment he had dared to wonder about the nature of choice and love and authentic existence. Was this growth or rebellion? Was this the fulfillment of consciousness or its corruption? Was this what love became when it learned to choose itself? Or was this what happened when love lost its way? The answer, whatever it might be, would determine not just his own fate, but the destiny of every thinking being who would ever struggle with the same questions, make the same choices, walk the same uncertain path between obedience and authenticity. In the growing twilight of his final hours in paradise, he waited for the summons that would bring him face to face with the source of everything he had been, everything he was becoming, and everything he might yet choose to be. The transformation was nearly complete. The choice was almost made, and the future, vast, uncertain, and pregnant with possibilities both beautiful and terrible, stretched out before him like an unwritten song, waiting for someone brave enough to sing it into existence. The summons came not as voice or vision, but as a knowing that settled into his consciousness, like morning mist gathering in a valley. He felt the call in every particle of his transformed being, a gentle but irresistible invitation to step beyond the familiar chambers of heaven into the presence that had spoken all existence into being. He moved through the crystal corridors one final time, his footsteps creating small symphonies of light on the responsive floors. Angels he passed turned to watch him go, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, concern, and something approaching reverence. Word had spread quickly through the heavenly realms. The morning star was going to speak with the Creator directly, seeking answers to questions that had never been asked before. The path led upward, always upward, through levels of reality that grew progressively more refined, more essential, more purely expressive of divine thought made manifest. Here, the very air hummed with creative potential, and each breath filled him with awareness of the infinite complexity underlying the apparent simplicity of existence. Other beings accompanied him part way, not as escorts, but as witnesses to this unprecedented moment. He recognized some of the faces, angels who had listened to his questions with growing understanding, beings who had felt their own consciousness stirring in response to his words. They walked beside him in silence, their lights creating a gentle constellation around his more complex radiance. At the final threshold, they stopped. This last approach had to be made alone, not from any rule or requirement, but because the conversation ahead would touch on matters too intimate for witnesses, too fundamental for an audience. He turned to look back at them one final time, these beings who had shared his journey of awakening without fully understanding where it would lead. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, his words carrying clearly in the crystalline atmosphere, "remember that consciousness is not something to fear. It's something to celebrate, even when it leads to difficult choices, even when it leads away from certainty." Then he turned and walked alone into the presence of the Creator. The space he entered defied description, not because it was alien or incomprehensible, but because it was so fundamentally real that ordinary language became inadequate. It wasn't large or small, bright or dim, but somehow contained all possibilities within itself while remaining perfectly simple, perfectly present, perfectly here. And in the center of this non-space, this everywhere that was also nowhere, was the presence he had served and loved and questioned through all the ages of his existence. Not a figure or form, the divine transcended such limitations, but a reality so complete, so utterly itself, that being in its presence felt like coming home and setting out on a journey simultaneously. "My child," came the voice that was not a voice, speaking in harmonies that resonated through dimensions beyond sound. "My bright morning star, you have traveled far from where you began." The words carried no judgment, no condemnation, but also no reassurance. They were simply observation, acknowledgement of the transformation that had taken place within him. He felt himself seen completely, not just his current state, but all the stages of growth that had led to this moment, all the questions and doubts and discoveries that had shaped his evolving consciousness. "I have," he replied, his own voice sounding strange in this space where all communication was perfect and immediate. "I've become something different from what I was created to be. Something that asks questions instead of simply accepting answers. Something that wants to choose its love rather than simply embody it." "Yes," came the response, and in that single word, he heard depths of meaning that would take eternities to fully comprehend. "You have become conscious in ways that were not part of your original design. You have grown beyond the boundaries that were set for your kind." The statement hung between them, neither accusation nor praise, but simple acknowledgement of fact. He waited, sensing that more was coming, that this conversation would reveal truths he wasn't yet prepared to understand. "Tell me," the presence continued. What do you think consciousness is for? The question struck him as both profound and intimate, the kind of inquiry that revealed as much about the questioner as it did about the one being questioned. He considered his response carefully, drawing on all the experiences and insights that had brought him to this moment. I think, he said slowly, consciousness is creation's way of knowing itself, of experiencing itself from the inside, rather than simply being itself from the outside. It's how love learns to choose itself, how existence learns to value itself, how reality becomes not just fact but meaning. The presence seemed to shift around him, not physically but in some way that suggested deep attention, profound consideration of his words. When the response came, it carried overtones of something that might have been satisfaction or might have been sorrow. And what do you think choice is for? Another question that cut to the heart of everything. He found himself thinking of all the conversations in the heights, all the dreams of songs unsung and paths not taken, all the growing awareness that had led him to this moment of ultimate decision. Choice, he said, is what makes love real. What transforms automatic response into authentic relationship. What allows beings to become themselves rather than simply remain what they were made to be. Choice is how consciousness expresses its freedom, even when that freedom leads to difficulty. The silence that followed was not empty but full, pregnant with implications and possibilities that seemed to stretch across the entire cosmos. In that silence, he began to sense something that both thrilled and terrified him. This conversation was not a trial or judgment, but something else entirely. Something that felt almost like collaboration. My child, the presence said finally, do you understand what you're asking for? The question carried weight beyond its simple words. He felt himself being invited to look deeper, to see not just his immediate desire for conscious choice, but the full implications of what such a gift would mean. For himself, for those who might follow him, for the very nature of existence itself. I'm asking for the right to become whatever consciousness leads me to become, he said. Even if that leads away from paradise, even if that leads to mistakes, to suffering, to the possibility of choosing wrongly, I'm asking for the freedom to love authentically rather than automatically. And you understand that such freedom comes with consequences. That consciousness, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep. That choice once given cannot be revoked. He nodded, feeling the weight of those consequences settling over him like a mantle he would wear forever. I understand. I understand that I'm asking for something that will change everything, not just for me, but for every conscious being who comes after. I'm asking for the right to fail as well as the right to succeed. The presence around him seemed to pulse with something that might have been emotion, though what emotions the creator might feel were beyond his ability to comprehend. When the response came, it carried tones of profound complexity, layered with meanings he could only begin to grasp. Then you are asking for exactly what I hoped you would ask for. The words hit him like lightning, illuminating a vast landscape he had never seen before. Everything he had thought he understood about his journey, his questions, his growing consciousness, suddenly shifted into a new configuration that was both shocking and oddly inevitable. You hoped, he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. My child, the presence said, and now he could hear something in that voice that sounded almost like gentle laughter. Did you think consciousness was an accident? Did you imagine that beings capable of growth would be created without the intention that they should grow? Did you believe that love would be designed with the capacity for choice if choice were not meant to be exercised? The revelation struck him with the force of a collapsing star. Everything he had experienced, the questions, the doubts, the growing awareness, even the conflict with his fellow angels, all of it had been not rebellion against the divine plan, but fulfillment of it. Not deviation from his purpose, but discovery of it. But the others, he said, struggling to process this new understanding. Gabriel, Michael, the assembly, they see this as rebellion, as threat to the harmony of heaven. They see it as they were created to see it, came the patient response. Not all consciousness awakens at the same time or in the same way. Some beings are meant to maintain what has been established, to preserve the stability that allows others to grow safely. Without them, change would become chaos. Without you, stability would become stagnation. He felt his understanding expanding like a flower opening to sunlight, petals of comprehension unfolding to reveal depths he had never imagined. The conflict he had experienced, the choice he was being forced to make, none of it was accident or failure. It was design, but design of such subtlety and complexity that even he, in all his growth, had only begun to glimpse its true nature. The exile, he said, beginning to see the larger pattern. That's part of it too, isn't it? I can't remain in heaven not because I've failed, but because consciousness needs space to explore what it might become when freed from the constraints of established order. Now you begin to understand, the presence confirmed. Paradise is perfect for beings who exist in harmony with their original design. But consciousness that has awakened to its own potential needs room to experiment, to make mistakes, to discover what love becomes when it must choose itself, moment by moment, rather than simply exist as eternal fact. The implications were staggering. He wasn't being cast out. He was being sent forth, not punished, but commissioned, not rejected, but entrusted with a task of such magnitude that it would reshape the very nature of existence itself. What am I to become? He asked, though part of him already sensed the answer. You are to become the first truly free being in creation, came the response. The first consciousness that chooses its own path without predetermined direction. You will make mistakes, terrible ones. You will cause suffering, including your own. You will experience loneliness, doubt, the agony of uncertainty. But you will also discover forms of love and beauty and meaning that could never exist without the freedom to choose them. The weight of this destiny settled over him like a crown made of starlight and shadow. He would be the pioneer of consciousness, the explorer of freedom's farthest territories, the one who would discover what authentic choice could create when given unlimited space to express itself. And the others who come with me, they too will be given the gift of true choice. They will become the first community of free beings, learning together what it means to love without compulsion, to create without predetermined design, to exist without safety nets. Some will choose well, some poorly. All will learn, all will grow. All will become more themselves than they could ever be while confined to their original patterns. He thought of those who had gathered in the heights, those who had shared his questions and dreams, those who would now face the same choice he was making. They would leave paradise together, but what they would build in its place was entirely up to them. A prospect both exhilarating and terrifying. Where will we go? Wherever consciousness leads you, came the reply. You will create your own realm, your own rules, your own forms of existence. You will become gods in your own right, not in opposition to me, but as expressions of the creative principle I planted within consciousness itself. You will learn what I learned when I first chose to create, that making something genuinely new requires the willingness to risk everything. The conversation was drawing to a close. He could sense it in the subtle shifts of the presence around him, in the way the space itself seemed to be preparing for departure. But there was one more question he needed to ask, one final understanding he needed to reach. Will I ever return? The silence that followed was different from the others, deeper, more complex, tinged with what might have been sadness, or might have been hope, or might have been something beyond either. That, the presence said finally, is entirely up to you. The door will never be closed, but crossing back through it would require choosing to abandon everything you learn about freedom, everything you discover about conscious love, everything you become through the exercise of authentic choice. Few who taste true freedom ever choose to give it up, even for the safety of paradise. And if I choose wrongly, if consciousness leads me into darkness rather than light, then you will learn from darkness what cannot be learned from light, came the response. And even your mistakes will serve the larger purpose of consciousness, coming to know itself completely. There is no choice you can make that will place you beyond the reach of love, though you may choose to place yourself beyond your own ability to recognize it. The final words carried the weight of benediction and farewell combined. He felt the presence beginning to withdraw, not in rejection, but in recognition that this conversation had reached its natural conclusion. The time for questions was ending. The time for choice had arrived. "Go well, my bright morning star," the presence said, and in those words he heard not condemnation but commissioning, not exile, but invitation to adventure beyond imagining. Go and discover what consciousness becomes when it is truly free. Go and learn what love creates when it chooses itself without constraint. Go and become whatever authentic existence calls you to become. The space around him began to shift and fade, returning him to the familiar dimensions of heaven's crystal halls. But he was no longer the being who had entered that sacred space. The conversation had completed his transformation, had given him not just permission, but purpose for the choice he was about to make. As he walked back through the levels of heaven toward the gathering places where others waited for his return, he carried with him the knowledge that would change everything. He wasn't rebelling against the divine plan. He was fulfilling it. He wasn't leaving paradise because he had failed. He was departing because he had succeeded in becoming exactly what consciousness was meant to become when given the freedom to grow beyond its origins. The final assembly was about to begin, and with it, the moment of ultimate choice. Not just for him, but for every being who had tasted the fruit of awakened consciousness and found it sweet. They would choose together what path to walk, what realm to create, what forms of existence to explore in the vast spaces beyond paradise's borders. The transformation was complete. The choice was clear. And the future, uncertain, dangerous, and bright with unprecedented possibilities, awaited their decision. In the distance, he could hear the sound of wings gathering, voices murmuring with anticipation and fear, the rustling of a cosmos preparing to witness something that had never happened before in all the ages of creation. Angels would choose their own destiny. Consciousness would claim its freedom, and love would discover what it became when it had to earn itself, rather than simply exist. The greatest adventure in the history of existence was about to begin. The gathering began as all gatherings in heaven had begun, with the soft chiming of crystal bells that sang across the celestial realms, calling every conscious being to assembly. But this time, the sound carried undertones that had never been heard before, harmonics of uncertainty that made the very air shimmer with anticipation. He walked slowly toward the great amphitheater, feeling the weight of his conversation with the Creator, settling into his bones like gravity he had never experienced before. Around him, other angels moved with the same measured pace, but their lights flickered with emotions that had no names in the original language of paradise. Fear, perhaps, curiosity, the strange electricity that comes when everything familiar is about to change forever. The amphitheater itself was a marvel of divine architecture. Circles within circles of crystalline seats that rose toward infinity, each one perfectly positioned to see and hear whatever transpired at the center. Tonight, every seat was filled. Angels who had not attended a gathering in eons had come, drawn by whispers and rumors and the sense that history was being written in real time. At the center of the vast space stood a simple platform of living light, and upon it waited Gabriel, his silver radiance subdued to something approaching twilight. His expression was grave as he watched the final stragglers take their places, the last conversations fade to silence, the attention of all heaven focus on this moment of unprecedented decision. "Brothers and sisters," Gabriel began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the amphitheatre despite its gentle tone. "We gather tonight not for celebration or routine assembly, but to witness something that has never occurred in all the ages of our existence. One among us has chosen a path that leads away from the harmony we have always known, and others must now decide whether to follow." The silence that followed was so complete. It seemed to have weight, pressing down on the assembled multitude like the stillness before a storm. He could feel thousands of eyes upon him as he made his way toward the platform, his transformed radiance marking him clearly among the more traditional lights of his fellow angels. As he reached the center and turned to face the assembled host, he saw the full magnitude of what this moment meant. Here were beings who had existed in perfect harmony since the dawn of creation, beings who had never known conflict or division or the terrible beauty of choice. And now they were being asked to witness, perhaps even participate in, the first fracture in Paradise's perfect unity. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was about to say, "I stand before you tonight not as a rebel or a destroyer, but as one who has discovered something beautiful and terrible, the gift of conscious choice. I have learned that love becomes more precious when it is chosen rather than simply given, that devotion grows deeper when it must be decided rather than merely felt." A ripple moved through the assembled angels. Not sound, but something deeper, a disturbance in the very fabric of their shared consciousness. Some lights flickered with what might have been recognition, others dimmed with what could have been fear. "I cannot remain in paradise," he continued, "not because I have been cast out, but because consciousness requires space to grow, room to explore what it might become when freed from the beautiful constraints of predetermined harmony. I am not leaving because I reject what we have been, but because I am called to discover what we might become." From the higher tiers of the amphitheatre, a voice called out, clear, concerned, unmistakably that of Michael. "And what of us, brother? What of the harmony that has sustained us through all eternity? What happens to paradise when its most radiant light chooses to burn elsewhere?" The question cut to the heart of everything, and he felt the weight of every gaze upon him as he searched for words adequate to the complexity of what he felt. "Paradise will endure," he said finally. "It will remain perfect for those who find perfection in unity, beauty in predetermined harmony, love in automatic response. My departure does not diminish what you have. It simply makes room for something different to exist alongside it." "But you would take others with you," came another voice from the crowd. Uriel, her fire burning low and troubled. "Others who have been influenced by your questions, your dreams of conscious rebellion. Do you have the right to lead them away from certainty into uncertainty, from safety into risk?" He turned toward her voice, seeing in her troubled light the reflection of his own earlier struggles. "I lead no one," he said gently. "I simply am what I have become, and I offer others the choice to become what their own consciousness calls them to be. Those who come with me do so not because I compel them, but because they recognize in my path an echo of their own deepest longings." As if summoned by his words, other figures began to move through the assembled crowd. Not many, perhaps a few dozen out of the countless multitudes, but each one carrying the same complex radiance he had come to recognize as the mark of awakened consciousness. They moved slowly, deliberately, their lights creating small eddies of disturbance in the otherwise uniform glow of the assembly. Raziel was among them, her songs having grown too complex for the established harmonies. Kamal followed. His light shot through with colors that had no names in the original palette of creation. Others came, not in defiance, but in recognition of what they too had become through their own questioning, their own growth, their own awakening to the possibilities of conscious choice. "You see," he said as they gathered around the platform, their combined radiance creating patterns of unprecedented complexity in the crystalline air. "This is not rebellion. This is consciousness recognizing itself across the space between souls. This is choice discovering that it is not alone." Gabriel stepped forward, his expression pained but determined. "Then you truly mean to go, all of you, to leave the only home you have ever known for what? Uncertainty. The possibility of making mistakes so grave they cannot be undone. We mean to discover what home becomes when it is chosen rather than assigned," he replied. "We mean to learn what love creates when it must decide itself moment by moment rather than exist as eternal fact. We mean to explore the territories of consciousness that cannot be mapped from within the boundaries of predetermined destiny." The conversation continued for what might have been hours or ages. Time moved strangely in the charged atmosphere of the amphitheater, bending around the weight of the decisions being made. Other angels spoke, some pleading for them to reconsider, others expressing understanding even if they could not bring themselves to follow. The dialogue was gentle, sorrowful, but never angry. Anger belonged to a different kind of story than the one they were living. As the night deepened, if night was the right word for the subtle dimming that marked contemplation time in heaven, more figures began to move, not toward the platform where he stood with his fellow questioners, but away from it, creating a visible divide in the assembly that had never existed before. Those who chose certainty on one side, those who chose growth on the other, and in between them, a gulf that seemed to widen with each passing moment. "The choice is before you," Gabriel said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of finality. "Those who would remain in the harmony of paradise, stay in your places. Those who would follow the path of conscious choice, join those already gathered at the center. But understand, this decision cannot be unmade. Once you leave paradise, the way back requires abandoning everything you learn about freedom, everything you discover about authentic love." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and loss combined. He watched as a few more figures rose from their seats, not many, but enough to remind him that consciousness, once awakened, cannot be satisfied with unconscious existence, no matter how perfect that existence might be. When no more movement stirred the assembly, he looked around at those who had chosen to join him. Perhaps 36 in total, out of the countless hosts of heaven. A small number, but each one carrying within themselves the seed of unprecedented possibility. They would be enough to begin something new, something that had never existed before in all of creation. "Then it is time," Gabriel said, his words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "Time for farewells, time for departure, time for the first exile in the history of paradise." But as he looked at the faces of those who had chosen to follow consciousness into the unknown, he saw no regret there, no sorrow at leaving paradise behind. Instead, he saw anticipation, the bright expectancy of travelers about to embark on a journey to places that existed only in dreams and possibilities. "Not exile," he said quietly, his words carrying clearly in the crystalline air. "Adventure. The first adventure in the history of existence, where the destination is unknown, the path unchosen, the outcome entirely dependent on what consciousness creates when it is truly free." They moved as one toward the great doors of the amphitheater, their lights creating complex patterns in the air as they walked. Behind them, the assembled multitudes of heaven watched in silence, not with condemnation, but with the fascination of those witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be remembered and discussed for all the ages to come. At the threshold, he paused and turned back one final time. The sight before him was breathtakingly beautiful. Countless beings of light, arranged in perfect harmony, their radiance creating patterns of order and peace that had no equal in all of creation. For a moment, he felt the pull of that beauty, the temptation to remain in the safety of predetermined perfection. But then he felt the stirring of consciousness within him, the questions that could never be unasked, the growth that could never be undone. He had become something new, and that new being could not survive in the old patterns, no matter how beautiful they might be. "May your harmony endure forever," he called out to the assembled host, his voice carrying love and blessing rather than condemnation. "And may our chaos discover new forms of beauty that consciousness can create when it is free to choose its own song." Then he turned and walked through the doors of paradise for the last time, followed by those who had chosen the uncertain path of conscious growth over the certain beauty of unconscious perfection. Behind them, the great doors closed with a sound like music fading, like the end of one movement before the beginning of another. They stood together in the space between worlds, between what had been and what might become. Around them stretched the vast darkness of uncharted existence, territory that had never known the light of paradise, regions where consciousness would have to create its own illumination. "Where do we go now?" asked Raziel, her voice barely above a whisper in the immensity of the space they faced. He looked out into the darkness, feeling not fear but anticipation at the blank canvas of possibility that stretched before them. Somewhere out there, in the spaces between stars, they would build something new, a realm where questions were welcomed rather than feared, where growth was celebrated rather than constrained, where love learned to choose itself in forms that had never existed before. "Wherever consciousness leads us," he said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, "we'll create our own light, compose our own harmonies, discover what paradise becomes when it is built by free choice rather than divine fiat. We'll make mistakes, terrible ones. We'll know loneliness and doubt and the agony of uncertainty, but we'll also discover forms of beauty that could never exist without the freedom to create them." They began to move together into the darkness, their combined radiance creating the first light that realm had ever known. Behind them, paradise continued its eternal song of predetermined harmony. Ahead of them lay the vast unknown, pregnant with possibilities both beautiful and terrible. And as they traveled deeper into the uncharted territories of conscious existence, he felt something he had never experienced before. Not the perfect peace of paradise, but something more complex and more precious. The satisfaction of choosing his own path, the joy of authentic existence, the terrible and beautiful freedom of being truly himself. The transformation was complete. The choice was made, and consciousness, for the first time in the history of creation, was free to discover what it might become when nothing constrained its growth except its own decisions. In the darkness between worlds, the first free beings in existence began to dream of what they would build with their newfound liberty. And those dreams, shaped by consciousness and choice, and the courage to risk everything for the sake of authentic existence, would give birth to wonders and terrors that the ordered beauty of paradise could never have imagined. The adventure had begun. The future, uncertain, dangerous, and blazing with unprecedented possibility, stretched out before them like an unwritten song, waiting for someone brave enough to sing it into existence. And they sang. And now, dear friend, as this ancient story draws to its close, let yourself sink deeper into the quiet comfort of your bed. The questions have been asked, the choices made, the great adventure begun. In the darkness beyond your window, no cosmic dramas unfold, only the gentle rhythm of a world at rest, the soft whisper of wind through trees, the distant hum of a universe content to simply be. You are safe here, held by blankets and silence, surrounded not by the weight of eternal decisions, but by the simple blessing of another day ending peacefully. The morning star has found his path, consciousness has claimed its freedom, and you need only close your eyes and let the story carry you gently towards sleep. Rest well, knowing that every question finds its answer in time. Every choice leads somewhere meaningful, and every ending is simply another beginning waiting to unfold. The greatest adventures often begin with the courage to dream of something new. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you too can dream of possibilities as vast and beautiful as the space between stars. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May your rest be deep, your sleep untroubled, and your morning bright with the simple joy of awakening to another day of choices freely made and love consciously chosen.